Real history is quite simply history taken straight from the man who makes the history to the man who writes the history to the book. You have here Anthony Eden, next to him a document that he's written. You may see that there are 3 lines crossed out in that document by Anthony Eden, and he's written in the margin the words, "too secret to record." And next to him is an author to the document, and finally the book that the author has written. So real history is what goes straight from the history that's in the archives to the book, as I write on the back of the book, with no academic prejudice, with no political input. It's real history. It's history as it really happened. It's interesting, incidentally, this Anthony Eden document. I mentioned it on the last occasion I was here. Anthony Eden writes in the margin of that document the words, "too secret to record." He crosses out those 2 lines, 2 or 3 lines in black ink and red ink, so that if you go to the archives and hold the document up against the light, you still can't read what was originally typed there by him, recording a conversation he had on December the 8th, 1942, with General Charles de Gaulle, and with 2 other French generals, and with a high mandarin of the British Foreign Office, Sir Alexander Cadogan. It incidentally refers to their plan to assassinate a foreign head of state, Admiral Darlan. It's unimportant for the purpose of this morning's topic, but it's an example of how real history can be found in the archives if you dig deep enough. If you look in the cabinet, British cabinet version of that document, those lines have vanished entirely. They're not even there. They've been crossed out. But if you look in Anthony Eden's papers, you find the original typescript draft with the lines crossed out and the words written next to them in his own red ink handwriting, "too secret to record, A.E., Anthony Eden." It's rather amusing when you come across documents like that. I remember around about the same time as I was signing the contract for this book in 1972, and I was doing the research on the Adolf Hitler book, I came across a document in the German Foreign Office archives, again, Foreign Office diplomats. The diplomat has written a record, and from this record we know that Adolf Hitler had a meeting early in July 1940 with 2 Gauleiters, 2 provincial Nazi governors, Gauleiter Wagner and Gauleiter Bürkel, who were in charge of the westernmost German provinces, which were in fact the newly annexed or recovered French regions of Alsace and Lorraine. And meeting with these 2 top Nazi Gauleiters in private, Adolf Hitler drew a sketch map of the future German frontier, where it would be after the war was over, after the peace treaty. It was a pretty generous enlargement of German territory at France's expense. Germany recovered all the old German territories like Alsace-Lorraine and quite a few other territories besides, and it was a pretty sensitive document. And Adolf Hitler ordered, at the end of this conference with these westernmost Gauleiters, he said, "Es darf kein Papier herüber entstehen." There is not to be any paper record made of what I've said today. And you wonder how I know that? It's because the diplomat who was present went back to Berlin and typed a memorandum on the conversation, ending with the words, "The Führer ordered that no record is to be taken of the conversation." Isn't that nice? And here you have Anthony Eden doing the same thing, saying, "too secret to record." And that's how we know it happened. Anthony Eden's private diaries are in the University of Birmingham, where I have read them all through from beginning to end. And I must say it's a rather sad voyage when you read some of his private diaries, particularly when he's dead. You read when he was a nobody, you read when he is a somebody, you read when he's failing and fading away, and you suffer all his triumphs and trials and tribulations. It is a very sad experience. I didn't know the Anthony Eden personal family story very well. I remember in 1940, I think it was, reading in the diary about how he went to Eton College to visit his son, Nicholas, who was at Eton College, which is England's premier school, or one of England's 2 or 3 premier schools. And Anthony Eden actually wrote in his diary about how distressing it was for him to stand outside the chapel at Eton College and see all the pupils streaming out with large numbers of dirty, unkempt and slovenly Jewish children as well. And that goes into his private diary, and of course he never published it, and it's not in any of the published versions of his memoirs either. All their private feelings. And then 2 years later, Nicholas, this son of whom they're so proud, goes and joins the Royal Air Force. And then when you're reading the 1944 diary, suddenly you get message from the Far East that his son Nicholas is missing. plane has gone down somewhere in the mountains of Burma, and there's still some hope that they may find the wreckage and the son may be alive, and for the next few weeks while you're reading through the diary, you share his hopes that the son may be found. It's really very distressing to read somebody's private diary, and then eventually the word comes that the wreckage has been found. So these are the joys of writing real history. You do the work, and you're prepared to read the handwriting, read into somebody's handwriting, which starts as being illegible, but eventually becomes very easy. Then you can gather all the secrets and all the mysteries. And as I researched the life of Winston Churchill, who wrote no diary, I suppose he was too busy to write a diary. Either you're a diary-writing person or you're not. Goebbels was a diary-writing person. Eden was a diary-writing person. But Churchill wasn't. I managed to buy, or rather rent, many, many years ago, Churchill's desk diaries. He had a staff who would put on his desk each month a large new calendar pad, a large card, about 2 foot square, in which all the days of the month were printed in, and then they would be inked into these squares by himself or by his staff, all his appointments for that particular week. And the person who had them was his bodyguard, Commander Thompson. Commander Thompson died. I don't know how the bodyguard got them, but his godson offered them for sale at Sotheby's, and he wanted £500,000 for them, which they were probably worth for the autograph value and their historic value. And eventually Sotheby's took them off the auction block because the Churchill family protested that they were stolen property, so the son offered them to me. And I said, I'm not going to buy them, because I know what's going to happen with my kind of luck. 1 year later, the family comes along and takes them off me, and I don't get any refund. So anyway, I didn't have that kind of money, but I rented them. I mean, you can rent stolen property, so I rented the stolen property from the son for a year, and I made very, very good microfilm records of them. And I've just recently, in fact, this is the advance of technology, put them all on CD-ROM, so anybody can have these desk diaries who wants them. That's part of my contribution. And from these desk diaries, you can see what's happening. From the annotations, you can get a picture of what's happening. It's not so much the documents that matter sometimes as the little scribbles on them. And only recently, within the last year or two, the British government has released the records of the British Code-Breaking Agency, to which I referred in my talk yesterday. There was a sheet of intercepts, you may remember, of the SS messages from the Eastern Front. The Code-Breaking Agency was at Bletchley Park with the innocuous title, The Government Code and Cipher School. The Government Code and Cipher School. After the war, it became known as GCHQ, Government Communications Headquarters. So secret that nobody was allowed even to use the initials GCHQ. The whole British code-breaking effort was so secret that they didn't even refer to the ultra-secret. The documents were stamped with the word ultra. Nobody was allowed to use the word enigma in post-war histories. Historians weren't allowed to refer to the British code-breaking effort. The Joint Chiefs of Staff in the United States and the British Chiefs of Staff, forming together the Combined Chiefs of Staff, which continued to rule for a year or two after World War II, ordained that no official historians were to be allowed to be told of the Allied code-breaking effort, because it was so secret. And if you wonder what the logic behind that was, surely the war was over, and even the official government historians should have been allowed at least to know about it and to write about it. In the directive of the Combined Chiefs of Staff, which I quote in the introduction to this Churchill biography, you see the Combined Chiefs of Staff said, if it was ever announced that we had had such an enormous insight into the German secret internal messages, if this was made known, then this would give birth to a new stab-in-the-back legend for the Germans, and the word would get around that they had been unfairly defeated, which of course in a way they were. You can't really fight a war when both your hands are tied behind your back and your enemy is looking over your shoulder, effectively with a mirror poised above your head so he can read all your cards. And if that had become known, then the magnificent quality of the British and American victories would have been tarnished and diminished. And so the decision was taken, this fact is never going to be released or made known. And it was kept secret until 1974, when gradually the ultra-secret came out. But even then, the secret marched on in the British archives. They raided Churchill's own files, the British secret bearers. They raided Churchill's own files and weeded them of every document that referred to ultra. And in their reports, they didn't say we found 68 documents with ultra references in the Churchill files. they said we found 68 code word documents. 68 code word documents. They weren't even allowed to mention the word ultra in their own internal memoranda. It was as secret as that, which is an indication of how the secret was kept. Now, the reason I'm mentioning Bletchley Park and the Government Code and Cipher School is that I have found evidence within the last 2 years that this was the British terminal of a secret transatlantic link between Churchill and Roosevelt. Churchill and Roosevelt conducted an open correspondence with each other, which is in the public libraries now. A multi-volume series of the Churchill-Roosevelt correspondence has been published. Even in the early years after the war, publishing that series was a major diplomatic effort because each government had to consult the other about whether they were going to be permitted to quote this telegram or that. And eventually most of the telegrams were released, and finally all of the telegrams were released. And if you read the publication by Warren F. Kimball, who is a professor at Rutgers University, you have the impression that that is it. There is no more to be found. And you can imagine with what astonishment I therefore came across, scattered through the thousands of files of the Bletchley Park documents, which are in the British Public Record Office under the designation, the class HW. It's class HW for those of you who are historians. You go there, and you look in file HW1, and you find all sorts of messages from a man called C to Winston Churchill. And in your packets, those of you who arrived early will have found in your yellow welcoming packages this document. This is just one sample, which causes us to raise our eyebrows as historians. I have a few more copies here. I've got one more copy here and a few more on the back, and I'm quite happy to print out more copies later. Or those of you who've acquired the book will find that I've actually reproduced this document in the appendix at the back. You'll see this is the document signed C. C always used blue notepaper. In England, it's known as Basildon Bond paper. My name is Bond, Basildon Bond. Here we have C signing it. C was in fact Sir Stuart Menzies, M-E-N-Z-I or M-E-N-Z-I-E-S, the head of the British Secret Service. And he's writing a letter to Churchill saying, Prime Minister, I enclose a copy of a telegram. I enclose a copy of a telegram which has been received through my channels, addressed to you from the President. Now we know who the President was. I attached the relevant BJs, as well as Berlin Press Directive of 18th of January. This is 1944. BJs, I can explain, are an anagram. We're not quite sure what of. It may originally have been British-Japanese, British intercepts of Japanese messages. Some people say, well, it actually refers to the blue jackets in which the documents came, the blue folders. I've seen them referred to in the private diary of the Deputy Chief of the British General Staff as the Black Jumbos, and they were also referred to quite freely in conversation as the Black Jumbos. The BJs were the intercepts. Not necessarily intercepts of Japanese messages, they were decodes and decrypts of any diplomatic message. In this case, I think it was a Spanish telegram that had been intercepted by the British code breakers and duly deciphered. But what is significant here, of course, is that this is a letter which is being sent to Churchill through my channels, through British Secret Service channels, SAS channels. It's being delivered to Churchill by the head of a Secret Service, and it's coming through Secret Service channels, and it's never been published. It's one of a series. And Churchill has written across the document in his typical reading, S of S Foreign Affairs, Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, pray comment on this if you can. WSC, 20th of January 1944. It all went with lightning speed, you see. It's all the same day. I'm not quite sure where the link was at the American end. I think the American end terminal was effectively Sir William Stevenson, the head of the British Secret Service in the United States. You may know of him as the man called Intrepid. That was the title of a book written by another William Stevenson, an extraordinary coincidence, an author with the same name but a different spelling, who wrote the biography of Sir William Stevenson, the Canadian, based in New York, He had a 00 code number from the British Secret Service. He was the head of the British Secret Service in the United States, a close friend of Winston Churchill, a close confidant. He ran the Secret Service in this country. He carried out the sabotage and the assassinations as dictated from London. The messages went from Stevenson to Menzies to Churchill, and they went from Roosevelt to Stevenson. And that was the channel that was used. I think in the United States they used the FBI wireless transmitting station on Chesapeake Bay. I went once to interview the man who was in charge of the American end of that. He lived outside a town called McLean, which has some kind of connection, I understand, with the Secret Service in this country. And I visited this gentleman about 20 years ago, and the conversation lasted only 35 seconds on his doorstep. And I told him what I was there for. He said, "I'm afraid I can't talk to you." He shut the door. So he knew more than he was prepared to talk about. The Americans gradually learned of this secret communication channel between Churchill and Roosevelt. And this may surprise that I put it like that. Roosevelt was communicating with Churchill, and his own diplomatic service, the State Department, didn't know it was going on. We know this was the case because the Undersecretary of State in the United States, a man called Adolph Burley, B-E-R-L-E, writes a very full daily diary, which is in the Roosevelt archives. And he describes paying a visit to Lord Halifax, who was the British ambassador in Washington, early in 1942, to ask him about rumors that there was a flood of top-secret code messages going through the FBI link to England and coming back through the same channels, of which the State Department were not aware. And the record written by Burley in his private diary says, "I took this up with Sir William Stevenson." Effectively, I'm paraphrasing this. I had to be careful because in the court in London I was accused of distorting documents when I quoted them like this from memory. It's a document I read 20 years ago. So paraphrasing, Burley writes in his diary, "I took this up with Sir William Stevenson, and Stevenson implied that it reflects a series of top-secret messages between the President and the Prime Minister." Whereupon Burley went to see Lord Halifax to ask him about it. And Lord Halifax said that he had questioned Stevenson about it, and Stevenson denied it. But Burley writes in his diary, "As I left him, I could see there was something of a sneer on Lord Halifax's face, and I think there's been some tall lying going on around here," which is a nice way of putting it. I quoted the actual passage in the Churchill biography. So these two great statesmen were communicating with each other through the back door, and only allowing the Foreign Office in England and the State Department in the United States to know about these communications and what was in them, whatever the President and the Prime Minister saw to be fit. I'd like to know what is in the rest of that communications exchange, and I've written to the British government about it, and I've asked them to search their archives, and we had a conference in the British Archives, the Public Record Office, on a very similar subject 6 weeks ago, which I attended, and there was the head of the Bletchley Park archive system there as one of the lecturers. And that was the question I put to her. I said, "Is there still in your secret archives of Bletchley Park a Churchill-Roosevelt correspondence file?" And she said she wasn't aware of one. And I drew her attention to another document like this from the same file, which actually had at the top, written in handwriting, the word PM file, PM's file, Prime Minister's file, indicating that there was a special file kept at Bletchley Park for this secret channel of correspondence. We don't know what's in the channel of correspondence. I put in the appendix to this book a number of examples which are scattered through these thousands of HW1 files, which clearly indicate that it was matters of a top-secret nature when a message was intercepted from Hitler to the German High Command using the teleprinter code machine network known as the Geheimschreiber. The Germans called it the Geheimschreiber, the secret writer, the secret teleprinter. The British codebreakers called it fish. And they then assigned to each of the different kinds of code within that group various kinds of fish names, like tunny and sturgeon and so on. I don't think there was a Jewfish among them, but so they may have been. I don't know if that name of fish is still allowed in this country or not. I understand that the Anti-Defamation League is protesting about this association. A shark would probably be better. There was actually a code called, I know it's unfortunate, in Virginia Beach and Florida and all that now, but there was actually a code codenamed Shark. And the Geheimschreiber revealed in October 1943 that Hitler had changed his strategy in northern Italy and was reassigning certain lines of defense to Kesselring, who was in charge of the defense of northern Italy. And there's a top-secret correspondence between Churchill and Roosevelt about that, which went through this secret link of vital importance if you're writing the history of that period. But we don't know exactly what was said, because it's only reflected in the covering letters like this, and the fact that such telegrams went and were responded to, and we're not entirely sure what they were. And of course, somewhere in the United States, there must be the corresponding mirror image of the correspondence. Probably not in the Hyde Park Library of President Roosevelt. It's probably in the NSA or at Arlington Hall or one of the other centers of archival depositories of the intelligence system in this country. This is what makes writing history such fun. Because we're looking constantly for something which we suspect is there, and you get a clue that it's there, and then it's your duty to dig deeper. And of course, if you're a conformist historian sitting in your book-lined cave plucking the books off the shelves, you're never going to find that kind of thing. Because the lines have been scratched out and they don't exist. Because you can't dig deeper in a book-lined library. You've got to go into the archives and start looking at the abstruse files. You've got to spend 3 or 4 days trawling through hundreds and hundreds of files and finding nothing at all. And you may be a bit sleepy that afternoon. You may have been moving it up the night before and you flip over a page and you've missed the important penciled note at the top of the page which tells you, yes, there was a file called the PM's file. But and you've got to have a long stamina. It's a long-winded research. I can tell you I have a file in the bottom of one of my filing cabinets in London which is called the transatlantic telephone traffic between Churchill and the President, which is the other arm of my talk this morning. At the beginning of October 1939, the phone rang in Churchill's apartment in Morpeth Mansions in London, not far from Parliament. He had a seedy little kind of one-up apartment in this mansion block, and a Victorian block. I went and visited it once. His apartment was up for sale, and I could have exchanged it for mine, and I thought that would be really ironic if I could go and live in Churchill's old apartment. And the phone rang in that apartment around about October the 3rd. The war had been running for a month, and Churchill was Navy Minister in England. He was the first Lord of the Admiralty, as he's known. He wasn't the Prime Minister at that time. And it was the President of the United States phoning him. Now, this alone is an unusual fact, because etiquette dictates that presidents as heads of state, or presidents even as first ministers, can't telephone a minister in a foreign administration. It would have to go through the Prime Minister of the foreign administration who would then pass it on. But no, the phone rang in Churchill's apartment and it was the President himself. And Churchill was dining that evening with a couple of admirals and he excused himself and went into the next room and took the call, and he came back looking very satisfied. And a correspondence started at that time between Churchill as a minister for the Navy in Britain and Roosevelt as President of the United States. I say started, but it may well be resumed. Because, of course, the fact that the first letters between the two are in October 1939 doesn't mean to say there was no other channel of communication they used. I suspect that one channel they used was Felix Frankfurt, the eminent Justice of the Supreme Court in this country. There are references to that in Frankfurt's private diary in the Library of Congress, which indicate that he was conveying messages between the two men at that time. Churchill desperately wanted to bring the United States into the war, rather than making some kind of unsatisfactory peace with Adolf Hitler. And he had started communicating through these backdoor channels in a totally unconstitutional manner, and reprehensible manner, one would think, behind the back of Neville Chamberlain, his own Prime Minister, with a foreign head of state. Simultaneously, his son was taking up conversations with the Soviet government through the ambassador in London, Ivan Maisky. I know that from the Moscow archives. There are records in the Moscow archives of Maisky's telegrams reporting these conversations. Interestingly, of course, in 1940, and greatly to the embarrassment of Winston Churchill, it turned out that the code clerk in the American embassy in London, a man called Tyler Gatewood Kent, about whom Mr. Mark Webber may want to tell us something in the discussion period, was making secret, furtive copies of this correspondence that went on between Churchill and Roosevelt through the American embassy. He was so incensed by the fact that a British minister was trying to drag his country, the United States, into a war which was no concern of the United States, that Gatewood Kent thought it his patriotic duty, Tyler Kent thought it was his patriotic duty to make copies of these telegrams, only about a dozen or so of which we know in that period of the first months of 1940 between the two men. And eventually, in May 1940, Tyler Kent was arrested by the British Secret Service, by MI5, and at the request of the American government, instead of being repatriated to the United States to be put on trial as a traitor, because he was intending to turn these documents over to the Germans to humiliate and embarrass the British, the Americans requested that Tyler Kent should be put on trial in Britain, and he was stripped of his diplomatic immunity so that he could be put on trial in the famous Old Bailey and locked away, and nobody would hear about him. So the whole Tyler Kent story was kept under wraps until the end of the war, when he was sent back to the United States, and of course by that time the whole picture had changed. What is interesting about the Tyler Kent story is that it mirrored the fact that there was a secret channel of communication at that time between Churchill and Roosevelt, where they were using at that time State Department channels and US Navy Department channels to conduct correspondence. In May 1940, on May the 10th, Churchill became Prime Minister, and the picture shifted slightly. But Churchill had this conspiratorial, furtive element about him, if I can put it like that. Throughout the war, throughout my Volume 1 and Volume 2, you'll see that he repeatedly sends out a commander to do a job. He sends an admiral to Norway, he sends a general to Dunkirk, he sends a general out to the Western Desert in North Africa, and he then, at the same time as he sends this man out to do the job, he says, here's a secret code you can use to communicate directly with me, bypassing the War Office, bypassing the Admiralty. It was typical Churchill that he would always set up this back door so that these commanders could communicate directly with him, and they give him direct information, that he could issue direct orders to them. To Lord Gort, he sends a telegram at the time of Dunkirk, saying, you are to advance to the coast. I mean, history would say you are to retreat to the beaches, but no, you are to advance to the coast, and you are not to inform your allies to the left and right what you are doing, which is the most shameful act in a coalition war. That you pull your own army, the British army, out of the expeditionary force, British expeditionary force, you pull it out of the line in France, because the Germans are pouring forward, and you don't tell the unfortunate Belgians and French that you're doing this, and you leave them just hanging in midair, because you're going to get to safety if you possibly can. And that shameful telegram is in the French files, not in the British files. It's been taken out of the British files, but I found it in the files of the French Prime Minister, Paul Reynaud, in France. I visited his widow at that time in the 1970s, still alive, one-armed widow with her one remaining arm. I persuaded her to sign an authorization for me to see her husband's papers. And there was this shameful telegram in the French papers, in the Paul Reynaud papers. This telegram that Churchill sent using his private line of communication to Lord Gort, who was the general in charge. And he did the same with Admiral Cork at the time of the Norwegian expedition in April 1940, which ended with the fiasco, which ironically left Churchill in charge as Prime Minister, because the fiasco in Norway resulted in a debacle which caused the overthrow, the downfall of the Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, and his place was taken, regrettably I would say, by Winston Churchill. And he did the same in North Africa when he established a private line of communication with Claude Auchinleck, the British Commander-in-Chief in North Africa, until the summer of 1942. And the War Office was repeatedly distressed to find that Churchill was communicating directly, behind its back, with this commander in the field. Now, I'm not going to pass judgment on whether it was a good or a bad thing that Churchill had this dual line of communication through official channels and through unofficial channels. His subordinates, like General Brooke, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, were such weak characters that they didn't really protest effectively enough. They should have said, either Winston, you sever that link, or I resign, because it's completely impossible for me to run the General Staff if you're going to go behind my back repeatedly and issue orders to the Commanders-in-Chief and undermine what I'm doing. So it was in Churchill's nature to establish these private links. Now, what about that telephone conversation in October 1939? How did it come? Well, there was a radio telephone link at the same time as there was a transatlantic cable. The transatlantic telephone cable was in its infancy. It didn't carry very much traffic, and at the beginning of World War II, it was decided to cut the cable to make it impossible for the enemy to tap into the telephone cable. So ironically, all traffic by telephone across the Atlantic went thereafter by radio telephone through a scrambler system. It was scrambled. The scrambler system had been made by a German firm, effectively. They'd designed it. The patent was a patent of the Siemens Corporation, and it's no surprise, therefore, when we learn that the radio telephone link across the Atlantic had been unscrambled by the Germans, and they were listening into every telephone conversation that they could intercept. After they had invaded the Low Countries, Holland and Belgium and France, they set up near The Hague a listening post. The listening post was in a direct line of sight, so to speak, between the American end at Washington, London, and The Hague. So they were catching the back traffic, the radio traffic. They could listen in very clearly to all the radio traffic going across the Atlantic, and within no time at all they were recording hundreds upon thousands of these conversations that went across the Atlantic by radio telephone. I'll say straight away that this very unsatisfactory state of affairs from our point of view lasted until the end of 1943, 4 years at least. How do we know this? In the private papers of Heinrich Himmler, the chief of the SS, you'll find the transcripts of the conversations. You won't find them in the British archives. You won't find them in the American archives, but you find them in the archives of the SS, scattered around these intercepts of Churchill's telephone conversations. Isn't that extraordinary? But the extraordinary thing is that they had intercepted thousands of these conversations, and only a few of them survive in the German archives. None in the British archives, and none in the American archives. So now you can understand why I've got that very faded and battered file slot in the bottom of my filing cabinet in London for over 30 years, into which I've been putting sedulously every page of paper I can find referring to these intercepts. Because therein lies the tale, in my view. Ignore the Warren Kimball, beautifully printed volumes of Churchill-Roosevelt correspondence. That's not where you'll find the real history. Ignore the Churchill archives in Cambridge. Ignore the Public Record Office, because they're not going to help us on this. You've got to try and find the transcripts of those conversations between those men, because that's where the history was decided between these two. Look at the private diary, not of Adolf Burley, not of Henry Stimson or somebody like that. Look in other private diaries. Look in the diary of the Secretary of Agriculture, Claude F. Wickard. I was sitting one day in the Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park, and sitting opposite me was Schlesinger, Arthur Schlesinger himself, the grand guru, the historian on President Roosevelt. And we recognized each other instantly, I would like to say. Anyway, he knew of my work. He said, "Hey, I've read your book, Hitler's War, great book." And we went and had lunch together. And I said, "What do you make of that conversation in November 1941 that Roosevelt had with his cabinet?" There was no Roosevelt cabinet, but there was a kind of a kitchen cabinet where Roosevelt called in all his ministers. And unlike the British cabinet, which kept detailed, meticulous records, which are sanitized, of the cabinet meetings, there are no records of the American cabinet meetings. No official record was kept, no minute was taken, which makes it difficult to write history. Were it not for the people who sat around the table, chewing their fingernails, biting their pencils, and writing private diaries afterwards. Claude Wickard. And Schlesinger said, "What do you mean, the Wickard diary?" And I said, "You hadn't read the Wickard diary then. It's up there on the shelves here in the library. The original handwritten diary of Claude Wickard, the Secretary of Agriculture." He said, "Well, Jesus, perhaps I ought to have a look at it then." And that's what encourages me when I find that even a great historian, a truly great historian like Schlesinger, it hasn't occurred to him to read the diary of the Secretary of Agriculture, because you think agriculture doesn't really play much of a part in the war, does it? It does, of course. You can't fight a war without a good harvest. Look at 1939. Look at 1938, the Munich Treaty. So, what do we find in the Wickard diary? He's writing a record of every Friday cabinet meeting that President Roosevelt holds. And on, I think, November the 4th, or thereabouts, 1941, a month before Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt says, "I had a conversation a day or two ago with Churchill, with the Prime Minister. He wants us to go ahead with a preemptive strike against Japan. I'm saying again, I am recalling this from memory, just in case there's any lawyers here making records who are going to have me up in court a month from now or a year from now saying that's not exactly what he said. You'll find the exact quotation in my volume. I quoted this particular passage. Roosevelt says, I was talking it over with Churchill a day or two ago, and he wants us to deliver a preemptive strike against Japan. And suddenly it makes sense when you look at the maps of the operations staff of George Marshall, where they've got concentric rings centered on the Philippines, and they've sent the B-17 bombers out there, and the rings are designed to show whether they can reach Tokyo yet with the B-17 bombers they sent out to the Philippines. And then you understand what the planning is going on, because these two men are up to something. So why did they get in this mess with Japan? Well, you look a bit further back and you find that there's a record in the papers of Harry Hopkins of a telephone conversation between Hopkins and Roosevelt from Chequers, Churchill's home, at the end of July, I think it's July the 25th, 26th, 1941. In the middle of the night, Churchill telephones the President, and Hopkins comes in and joins him, and the two of them telephone the President, and they're talking about the need to issue sanctions against Japan. And those of you who are familiar with the story of the run-up to Pearl Harbor know that the sanctions against Japan were what triggered the Japanese decision to go ahead with the attack, because they were effectively going to run out of oil 3 months from now. The important question is who took the decision not just to issue general sanctions against Japan, the delivery of war materials, the purchase of silk and so on, but to add an oil embargo. The oil embargo against Japan that was pronounced on, I think, July the 26th, 1941, was what brought about Pearl Harbor. Originally, Roosevelt told his cabinet that no way would he go along with an oil embargo, because he knew that would mean war. When the sanctions are pronounced on July the 26th, they include the oil embargo. And my own theory, presumption, for which I have not the slightest shred of evidence apart from circumstantial, is that it was agreed between the two men in that telephone conversation in the middle of the night that you've got to add oil to it. And Churchill was reassuring Roosevelt, go ahead, put in the oil embargo, because believe me, the Japanese are not going to make war when push comes to shove. Churchill believed throughout 1941 that the Japanese weren't serious with their threat. But we don't know because we don't have the transcripts. The conversations were definitely recorded at the British end because one of the British censors, a woman, still alive, recorded her reminiscences on the BBC radio about a year ago. And she recalls very deeply, very clearly, Winston Churchill making the telephone calls to Roosevelt. She doesn't recall very much about what they actually talked about, which is a good thing, because we would have got a bowdlerized version. She recalls the external details, that Churchill didn't like being interrupted and reminded of the censorship warnings. They weren't allowed to talk about strategic plans. They had to use code words. They had to use euphemisms. They weren't allowed to identify themselves. You'll find there's one hilarious telephone call that Anthony Eden makes in this book, my second volume. Anthony Eden telephones Winston Churchill on May the 21st, 1943. Churchill telephones Anthony Eden. Churchill is in Washington, visiting Washington, on May the 21st, 1943, and Roosevelt has read him the riot act over General de Gaulle, who's becoming increasingly obstreperous, more communist-aligned, more hostile to the Allied cause, causing increasing difficulties, and Roosevelt is dropping broad hints that it is time to terminate General de Gaulle with extreme prejudice, to use modern language. And Churchill telephones Anthony Eden, who's running the show back in London. Churchill telephones Anthony Eden, and the two of them use code names for each other, and they use code names for everybody else. And Churchill tells Anthony Eden that the president here has caused him immense problems over Joan of Arc. Everybody understood who Joan of Arc was. That was Charles de Gaulle. And the president has insisted that immediate steps should be taken to get rid of him. And the conversation goes on like this, and we know that this conversation took place because it was intercepted by the American Navy and transcribed. You wonder why the American Navy had anything to do with this. Well, the answer is that the American Censorship Bureau that was set up at the time of Pearl Harbor divided these censorship jobs into various fields. And this interception of telegraphic and telephone communications abroad and overseas was the job of the U.S. Navy. They had the best capability, and under a man called Captain Fenn, F-E-N-N, the Censorship Bureau was set up, and Captain Fenn sent a telegram to the State Department that night with the transcript of the conversation between these two Englishmen, which has been intercepted. And halfway down the transcript it says, at this point the conversation was interrupted, and we are able to identify who the speakers were, because when traffic was resumed, the London end came on and said, hello, hello, is that you, Winston? So forget about the need for secrecy. Churchill on one occasion telephoned the White House when he was in Florida and said, I'm going to be coming back from Florida to Washington on Tuesday. I can't tell you the means I'll be using for security reasons, but it'll be a choo-choo. So he wasn't all that security conscious, and this is an important thing to remember, because in October 1943, the Americans were fully aware from code breaking that the Germans were listening into the radio telephone line across the Atlantic. And of course this gets very difficult, because you can't reveal how you know these things. So George Marshall sends an angry message to Harry Hopkins in the White House, saying somebody's got to have a word with both the President and Roosevelt and Churchill about their loose talk on the transatlantic radio telephone. In his conversation this morning, of which we've seen a transcript, Churchill has been extremely frank about the coming strategic planning and operations, and it's going to endanger lives. That's what it's all about. There's quite a file of correspondence between Roosevelt and Marshall and the White House on this issue of Churchill's loose talk on the transatlantic telephone. And the infuriating thing is, we know from the British end and from the American end that transcripts were made of these conversations. At the American end, as I say, the US Navy Department made the transcripts on behalf of the Office of Censorship, the Bureau of Censorship. You ask where the records of the Office of Censorship are, and the answer is in the National Archives under seal in perpetuity. President Truman, at the end of World War II, issued an executive order that the records of the Bureau of Censorship were to be kept sealed in perpetuity. No one was to be allowed to see the actual transcripts or the letters that were intercepted. There was a corresponding office at the English end, the Department of Postal and Telegraphic Censorship, under Sir Edwin Herbert, who actually advised the Americans on how to run such an operation. At that time, the Americans took advice from us. We effectively set up the CIA for Europe. We sent over the British Secret Service, and we set up, first of all, the OSS. We provided the initial officers for the OSS, and eventually the Americans took it over after we had set the operation up. The same with the Bureau of Censorship. We told you how to open letters without letting it be seen that they've been opened, how to intercept radio traffic, and so on. At the British end, the records show quite clearly that transcripts were also made. The directives state that the person who initiates the conversation is to have a transcript made. So somebody sat down there writing a longhand record of every telephone conversation, and these transcripts have vanished. And they're going to be worth looking for. I have had a 35-year search for them, both at the American end and at the English end, looking for the transcripts of the telephone conversations between Roosevelt and the Prime Minister in England, because that is where we're going to find out the real hidden history of World War II, how these two men steered things and guided public opinion and took the decisions while still leaving their general staffs in the blithe belief that they were the ones who called the shots. They didn't. And that's what this talk has been about. Thank you very much. Now, we can have a discussion about that, and you can ask questions, and I'm sure some of you have questions to ask. You will find that I've dealt very extensively with both topics in the two appendices at the back of this volume. One appendix on the subject of the radio telephone link across the Atlantic with all the records, and another appendix on the subject of this secret channel between Roosevelt and Churchill using the Secret Service link through which they exchange code messages. Yes?
I heard of the Venona.
The Venona secret messages, yes.
You didn't mention anything about the Soviet Union archives.
Yes.
Because they had supposedly...
Well, we had a very extensive discussion about Venona. I'll give a brief overview of what Venona was. Early on in the war and throughout the war, the British and American codebreakers and radio intercept services built up a very large file of intercepted messages that were passing between the capitals, London and Washington and Moscow, going to the KGB. Very evidently radio traffic concerning espionage activities. And I'm not sure where the word Venona comes from. I think this was one of the code words that was assigned by the NSA, or the wartime equivalent of the NSA, to this traffic. It was very, very difficult to decode, for the reason that it was encoded using what were called one-time pads. A one-time pad was a sheet of paper with random letters and numbers on it, which was used to pick out the equivalent when you're writing a code message. And as long as each sheet of paper you used was absolutely different from any other sheet of paper in the universe, then that was totally undecipherable. But of course, there's no such thing as a sheet of paper with random numbers across it that is totally different from any other sheet of paper with random numbers in the universe. Eventually, there will become evident systematic similarities in the pages, particularly if they're all printed by one printer or something like that. And if you're lazy, and if you're running short of one-time pads, as eventually you will, otherwise you're going to need stacks and stacks of 30,000 sheets just to write one brief message to someone, something like that. So lazy cryptographers would go back to a used one-time pad and reuse it, indicating to the Moscow end, I'm reusing pad number so-and-so, so-and-so. I'm putting it in simple terms as I understand it. And as soon as they do that, a little chink of light comes through for the code breakers. And they can begin looking at the similarities between the patterns to decode the message in front of them. They don't get all of it. They may only get 3 letters in a whole message. They may get 2 words. But eventually, the more times that particular error is repeated, if they have enough men working on it, and you can begin to understand the mind-breaking task this was for the code breakers, sitting there month after month, getting absolutely nowhere at all, looking at meaningless jumbles of letters. But then gradually little chinks of light began to come through, and they would illuminate one message after another. And they built up a huge file of all the intercepted messages, the Venona messages, and they would crawl backwards and forwards through this file of messages, playing them off against each new page of the one-time pad that had been accidentally reused by the cipher officer, until they built up more and more of the contents of each message. And the whole Venona file has now been released by the NSA in this country, and you can see there, I think it's something like 100 messages altogether that they've managed to make sense of. Some of them they made sense of all of them, some of them made sense of none of them, some of them they've only got the sender and the recipient. Most of them use code names for the people they're talking about, but you can work out who it is, because the code names are sometimes very transparent. I'm repeating to you what I've learned at this PRO, Public Record Office session in England about 6 weeks ago on the Venona case. It doesn't really concern what I've been talking about here, though. That is the end of that particular story. It's a fascinating subject. The code-breaking messages are the ones that are the most important, in my view. I tried to explain this to the High Court in London, that when you're looking at a message, I asked one witness or another, Donald Watt, Professor Watt, I said, when you're looking at the quality of documents in front of you, how would you rank them for reliability as a historical source? Would I be right in saying that right at the bottom of that table you would put eyewitness evidence, and right at the top of that table you would put code-breaking intercepts? Because code-breaking intercepts, they have no reason to be spurious or euphemistic, because the man who's writing it believes it's written in a secure code that nobody can read except the authorized recipient. And somewhere between you've got prisoner of war reports and captured documents and things like that. Captured document, of course, may always be deliberately planted on you. But a code-breaking message isn't necessarily, is less likely to be a plant. I said is less likely to be a plant because there are suspicions that the Japanese knew that we were reading their so-called purple code. We knew that they knew we knew it, if I put it like that. Because we intercepted German messages in which the Germans told the Japanese that they had understood in Washington that the Americans were reading the purple code. So there, after that point, which is May 1941, you've got to look at every purple message with a little bit of a suspicion, saying, well, although we appear to have cracked this message about Honolulu, the man in Honolulu being given orders to provide an exact grid chart of the layout of the battleships in Battleship Row and Pearl Harbor, is this something the Japanese want us to know that they've ordered? It becomes quite complicated once you know the enemy knows that you know, so to speak. But I think that the Japanese forgot that we knew about Pearl Harbor. It's as simple as that. So we're off your Venona track. But as I say, Venona has nothing to do with Churchill or Roosevelt. Yes.
Would it be correct to presume that the Germans knew of Japanese plans to bomb Pearl Harbor? And if they did, once the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, it's my understanding that Germany was under no treaty obligation to declare war, but rather exercised their discretion. I could be wrong on that, but the final part of my question is, why then did Hitler exercise his discretion to declare war on the United States?
Three totally separate questions, right?
Yes.
Starting with the last one, Hitler decided to attack the to attack the United States quite simply because the United States was already at war with Germany. Admiral Raeder, the commander-in-chief of the German Navy, repeatedly came to Hitler and said that the US Navy has been given orders to shoot on sight. Our submarines are operating at extreme disadvantage in the North Atlantic. Repeatedly, we're getting US warships under the sights, under our periscope sights, so we could torpedo them. We're hamstrung by the orders you've issued, which prevent us from doing that, even though these are obviously warships engaged in offensive actions against us. Please make a formal declaration of war which enables us to do what we're there for. Because otherwise we're losing the war in the Atlantic without even being able to fight it. So Hitler was just regularizing a status quo, that the war in the Atlantic already existed. What Hitler didn't anticipate when he declared war on the United States, he thought it was a cheap declaration to make because the United States was going to have its hands tied fighting Japan. He didn't expect the United States to take the unexpected step of declaring Germany first, that we will deal with Germany first and then turn around and settle the Japanese problem, which was in fact a strategic miscalculation of war-losing proportions, because if you think about it, Japan couldn't have won the war without Germany being still in the war. And the moment Germany was out of the war, Japan's fate was sealed. So it was quite obvious that the Americans would have to deal with Germany first, unless public opinion and sentiment over Pearl Harbor grabbed the American lion by its tail and swung it round to face across the Pacific. This brings back the question of whether the Germans knew about Pearl Harbor in advance. They didn't know about the intention to attack Pearl Harbor. There had been serious hints dropped by the Japanese ambassador Oshima, General Hiroshi Oshima, who was the very capable Japanese ambassador in Berlin. Over the previous few days, he had said things like, you must understand, he'd said this to Ribbentrop, the German Foreign Minister, you must understand that we need some kind of word from you about what your steps will be. Things may happen sooner than you can imagine. Japanese being an ambiguous language, that kind of sentence could be translated several ways, but the meaning was quite clear, that if you hesitate, he who hesitates is lost. We are about to do something, and this is the time for you to run your colors up the mast as well. I know from Hitler's own personal staff, who described it to me, that when the word of Pearl Harbor came, Hitler was completely stunned. He'd never anticipated this. It had come at a very low point in his own fortunes. On December the 2nd or 3rd, the Soviets had begun a counter-offensive. The German army in the east was in a desperate position. Its tanks weren't starting in the extreme cold, the guns weren't firing, the explosives were fizzing. The German army was all but lost. It was in retreat and abandoning its heavy equipment. And Hitler was in a very sorry pass when the word came that night. His press chief, Dietrich, the man who was at the back of the big color poster, which I had back there, and you'll see him on the photographs in some of my books. His press chief, Dietrich, came in with the first news agency report of the attack on the Japanese fleet in Pearl Harbor. And Hitler was overwhelmed with delight, and his foreign minister's liaison officer, a man called Walter Hewel, H-E-W-E-L, who wrote a private diary which his widow gave to me to use. Typically, I said to the widow, why is it you've not given this to Hilgruber or any of the other established historians? She said, Mr. Irving, they never asked me for it. They sit in their book-lined caves, these conformist historians, and don't bother to ask. And in this handwritten diary, Walter Hewel wrote down Hitler's words that night. He says, now we can't possibly lose this war. We have an ally now who hasn't been defeated in 1,000 years. And then he thought of it, and then he said, of course, we've got another ally, meaning the Italians, who've constantly been defeated. However, they've always ended up on the right side. Of course, that was prophetic words. And I used to say, when I went around the world lecturing in the old days, when I could go around the world lecturing, I used to say, I think it was Napoleon who once said, the Italians have never managed to end up on the same side that they started the war on, except for one occasion in history when they changed sides twice. And there was one Italian family who got up and walked out in indignation from the lecture there when I said that. Everybody else thought it was very droll. You had a middle question which I've forgotten, but the second part of the question. Yes, I thought so too.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. One more question. Michael Hoffman. Yes.
It's fair to say that the British Secret Service had far surpassed the German equivalent, the Abwehr, and would you attribute that to Canaris being a double agent? It seems to me that most of the German codes were being read by the British, and very little of the British and American traffic had been penetrated by the Germans.
That's not entirely true. That again is a multifaceted question. The British Secret Service was very good. We had expended a huge sum of money on the British Secret Service, and we had a complete faith in it. George Marshall, at the equivalent period, at the beginning of World War II, the Chief of Staff of the United States Forces, he had very little faith in code breaking, with the result that at the outbreak of war, we had thousands of code breakers working in secret encampments. We had, as I said yesterday, 3,000 code breakers working on the German police codes alone, which you may find was a very unrewarding field of research, except that the German police were scattered across the entire Nazi empire. And whenever there was an air raid on Hamburg or Kassel or Hanover, the local police, with their telephone lines down, would use the radio teleprinter to send code messages reporting the damage, reporting public morale, reporting all the problems, which factories had been destroyed, and so on, which Bomber Harris in England had on his desk next day in consequence. So the police codes were very well worth following in England, and we did that. You asked a question, were we better than Canaris' Abwehr? Well, I knew the widow of Canaris. I corresponded and visited her once when I was on the hunt for the Canaris diaries. Canaris wrote diaries, which exist somewhere, but I think they're buried and someone's forgotten where they are. Perhaps some widow threw them out with her late husband's papers, I don't know. Canaris, in my view, was incompetent. I don't know how he kept his job or got his job, probably through favoritism. I know that he was very close to Field Marshal Keitel, the chief of the German High Command, who protected him, and was deeply shocked and felt betrayed when it turned out that Canaris had been harboring treacherous thoughts. Canaris was finally hanged on April the 8th, 1945, in Flossenburg concentration camp. And because by that time the Gestapo had raided his files, had found the diaries and established that he had been plotting to overthrow Hitler and that he had been harboring these treacherous thoughts. It has always attracted the attention of historians of a certain bent, the question whether Canaris was hand in glove with the British Secret Service. I don't think he was. I would have been inclined years ago to say, being by nature conspiracy theorist, probably he was, but having worked now so extensively in the archives that have been released, I've not found the slightest trace of it. Neither first order nor second order nor third order evidence, no reference in private diaries, nobody hinting at our man at the top level in Hitler's headquarters, nothing that you would expect to find were that the case. I think that Canaris damaged the Nazi cause by his bungling and by the fact that he was so easily duped by our extremely clever deception tactics. I'll give you one example of how we duped him, and this is the case of the famous man who never was. It's dealt with in this book, Churchill's War, Volume 2. We took a corpse of a gardener, a Welsh gardener, who had tried to kill himself, or succeeded in killing himself finally, by swallowing a weed killer of a certain kind which left very few traces on the body. And we promoted that corpse of this Welshman to a Marine officer, dressed him in Marine uniform, kept him beautifully preserved for a couple of months, and then floated him out of a torpedo tube in a submarine off the coast of Spain, chained round his neck a courier's valise containing top-secret letters from London to Mountbatten and Eisenhower and others, revealing accidentally the location of the coming in next operation in the Mediterranean. Not against Sicily. Oh no, that's the grand decoy operation that we hope the Germans are going to fall for. We're going to be invading Greece at the other end of the Mediterranean. But it was all done beautifully. Heavy-handed British humour. I hope you're going to bring back a few cans of sardines. Ho, ho. Sardinia, this kind of thing. If the other operation has to go ahead instead. And the whole operation, I've read the whole file through now. It's just been released in England. The man who never was. The whole file is there with the way that the body was prepared, the way that everything that was put into his pockets was prepared, the dance hall tickets, the phony existence that was created for him, the letters from a bank manager asking about this £4, 7 shillings and 6pence overdraft, and when it was going to be returned, and his efforts to deal with the overdraft because he wanted to buy a ring for the fiancée that he had just met at the dance hall, and sure, there was the dance hall ticket in the other pants pocket. Beautifully prepared, the way that this man's phony identity was created, because they knew that the Gestapo would check up in England through its agents to find out if there was such a dance hall, and was there a dance that night, because the evidence contained in these letters was of such strategic importance that the Gestapo would undoubtedly go to enormous lengths to check it up. So the body was floated ashore. It landed off Cadiz. The Spanish Secret Service got hold of it. They got hold of the case. British naval attaché in Madrid, who had been tipped off to keep an eye open for word of a marine corpse being found and brought ashore. He reported to London duly 3 or 4 days later. Yes, a body has been found, and we've been contacted by the Spanish Admiralty with word that this body has been found. Apparently it crashed in a Catalina. There was a Catalina seaplane rubber boat dinghy found floating not far away from the body. That too had been pushed out through the torpedo tube of the submarine to create the image. And then, of course, the anxious wait. Will the Spanish do the decent thing and turn over the body untouched, or will they open that case? Eventually the case was handed back. I mean, very obligingly, the courier had the key to the case in his other pocket. The case was handed back by the Spanish authorities to the British naval attaché in Madrid. And they opened it, and there were all the letters still inside, and they were still sealed. So the question was, had the Japanese got hold of the documents inside and resealed them by magic or not? And 5 days later, Churchill is in Washington. This is May the 21st, 1943, the day of that telephone intercept. And he gets a message sent by pouch across from sea, one of these blue letters. This Operation Mincemeat was the name of the actual operation. And the message said very briefly, Operation Mincemeat, the enemy has swallowed the bait. Because the code breakers in Britain had intercepted messages going down the fish channel, the Geheimschreiber, from Berlin down to the outposts in Greece and in Sardinia, warning that the British were going to be invading and that certain secret documents had fallen into the hands of the German Abwehr. But there's a rider to this. Who believed these documents? Well, if you read the Goebbels diary, you see Goebbels says to Admiral Canaris, I don't believe these documents may be genuine, they may be a plant. And Admiral Canaris says there's not the slightest question of that. We've gone into this most thoroughly. It turned out the Gestapo did carry out checks in London. And they did find out that the dance hall had held a dance that night. So everything about that body was absolutely kosher, if you could put it like that. It would be so tasteless to put it like that. But hey, if you can't be tasteless here, where can you be tasteless? And it came up at Hitler's conference headquarters a few days later. Canaris says to Hitler, we have the stenographic record of that day. Canaris says to Hitler, we have received an extraordinarily welcome piece of vital information that's come from the body of a British courier that's been washed ashore, revealing that the target of the operation isn't Sicily but somewhere else. And we've taken all the necessary preparations. And the stenographic record shows Hitler just registering this fact, taking note of it. But I spoke with this stenographer who was at that conference, Ludwig Krieger. Now, Ludwig Krieger, who after the war resumed his duty as a conference stenographer and became eventually a very highly paid verbatim stenographer of the German Bundestag, the German parliament. He lived in Bonn, I visited him, and he still had all his old shorthand diaries and everything. in the First World War, he had been actually the private secretary of the head of the German Secret Service then, the famous Colonel Nicolai. Once again, the German archivists, the German historians had paid not the slightest attention to this man, Ludwig Krieger. But he sat for 2 days dictating onto tape for me his reminiscences. And Ludwig Krieger said, I remember so clearly that day when Canaris told the Führer about the find, the corpse, the Curia. And I remember that as Hitler, I was longing to say to Hitler, to the chief, but this may be a plant, this smells very fishy, the whole thing stinks. But of course, as a stenographer, he could no way could he interrupt the conference and say this to the supreme head of the Third Reich. And then he said, I remember that as he was leaving the conference room, Hitler turned round and he said, Übrigens, Herr Christian, by the way, Mr. Christian, this is the chief of staff of the German Air Force at that time, by the way, Colonel Christian, I think this thing stinks. I think könnte es nicht, I think it's a plant. So Hitler, with his very sound instinct, although all the signs of this intense effort by the British Secret Service to create the phony identity of the man, the corpse and everything else, something at the back of Hitler's mind, he disregarded this thing that had been given him on a plate, and he thought to himself, no, the obvious next step is Sicily, surely. Not the far end, not Sardinia, it's got to be Sicily. This is dumb. But the German armed forces took it the other way. It was put to them on a plate, and they abandoned thought about Husky, as it was called, the British operation, the landing in Sicily in July 1943, and they were taken totally by surprise when it began. Just like Normandy, 1944. Hitler said the invasion is going to be in Normandy, or Brest, that peninsula, and the German High Command said, oh no, it's going to be coming through Calais, through the narrow straits of Calais. And although Hitler ordered the 7th Army in Normandy had to get all the reinforcements and had to be the one that was ready for the invasion, the German High Command knew better. And quietly, it disregarded its instructions and reinforced the Calais area instead, the 15th Army. Very interesting when you look at Hitler's own personal involvement, which I know about because I spoke to all his staff and I've read all the telegrams at that level. I think that's all we have time for on this particular subject, ladies and gentlemen. Have a break now. Professor Martin is here to talk to us after the break on this highly interesting subject of the slave trade and its origins. 10-15 minute break. Thank you very much indeed.